Thanks very much, David. Quick introduction to the Aldersgate Group, because many of you might not have heard of us. We're a membership alliance for mainly major businesses in the UK, as well as NGOs and academic institutions. We work on nature and climate policy and go to government and say, big businesses want to take action in these areas, and these are the ways that you can help through policy. So I won't talk more about that, but just so you know what I'm doing standing here. While you were many of you sitting in this room this morning, the Chancellor said, and I quote, "Developers should be able to stop worrying about the bats and the newts." I think this panel is perfectly timed, because what we want to talk about is how we can make sure we look after, probably not bats and newts in the marine environment, but the equivalent of that, while enabling the other uses of that amazing offshore opportunity. So I should just talk about logistics briefly. As David said, there will be an opportunity for questions. There'll be roving mics when we get there, so after the initial presentations and panel interventions. Roving mics downstairs and upstairs, and you can submit your questions through Slido. We will take questions from Slido as well. So please store those all up and submit them through Slido while all the speakers are here, and we will pick those up as soon as we've finished with that. The first of our fantastic panel lineup is Jamie Moore, who's from the Crown Estate, and he's going to talk about their Marine Delivery Roadmap, integrating nature, clean power and industry for a thriving marine environment and communities. So over to Jamie.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here this afternoon, been invited to speak. My first coastal futures was back in the early 2000s. This seems to be a trend today. You know, it's like a get it off my chest. But the reason I mentioned that is I haven't been for about a decade now. I stepped away and did some non-marine stuff for a few years. And what a change. This is an absolutely incredible event. It's much, much bigger. Lots more people here. So I think it's shaping up to be wonderful. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the Crown Estate and about our Marine Delivery Routemap. But I thought I'd ease you in with a little video to start.
Crown Estate is a company for the country.
We manage the seabed and much of the coastline around England, Wales and Northern Ireland.
The UK has achieved amazing things, the second largest operational fleet of offshore wind in the world, but we need to act quicker if we're able to meet our nation's net zero targets.
The Whole of Seabed programme makes use of a unique set of digital geospatial tools to create a detailed understanding of future resources and demands, such as habitat restoration or offshore wind, for example.
But having evidence and data is only one part of the picture. We're using the Whole of Seabed programme to create essentially an action plan for the future.
The detailed evidence base generated by the Whole of Seabed programme is key to making the right decisions around how we use and develop the seabed. We are using this to develop a 2050 Marine Delivery Routemap with our partners. This will coordinate action to deliver net zero and nature recovery and meet the demands of all key sectors that use the marine space.
We aim for our work to make a positive difference, inspire other nations and organisations.
And it's hard to imagine a more exciting and fulfilling role than the future of our journey to net zero and a thriving marine environment.
So, hopefully that was a little useful intro to the Crown Estate and how we go about our work in the modern day. And I'm going to talk a bit more, as I said, about our Marine Delivery Routemap now. So we've invested really heavily over the last 15 years in our data, in our evidence, and our capabilities to be the most informed about the seabed for the assets that we manage. And we called that, as you saw in the video, our Whole of Seabed approach or our Whole of Seabed programme. And that's been really good, but really to date, we've generally applied that knowledge, that information, to try and answer one question at a time, try and solve one problem at a time. The difference with the Marine Delivery Routemap is we're now bringing this all together into one integrated delivery plan. And that's really important for us. We want to be more transparent. We want to be able to talk about our ideas for the future and to be able to collaborate in ways we haven't been able to before. So if you look at some of the things that the routemap's trying to help us with on the screen there, we're all aware of the huge interest in low carbon energy at the moment and the huge opportunity the marine space has to contribute to net zero. But we're really, really clear. The routemap is not just about one sector or one activity, one priority. It's about providing optionality for all sectors. We also want to place nature at the center of this decision making, so we treat it alongside all the sectors, all the interests with equal billing. And when I think about the question Dave introduced at the start of the session, that's my first key point. If you really do want a sustainable blue economy and to be able to hit all of your targets that you need to hit, you need to think about everything. You can't just look at one priority. You can't look at something in isolation. You really need to understand the full set of implications across all of the activities and interests in the marine space. So if we do this well, we start to generate information in a proactive way. We start to give visibility of plans, ideas. We're able to collaborate. We can galvanize the decisions that are needed to make investments, to unlock supply chains, to really drive the value in the onshore places that we started to talk about earlier today, drive that value from all of the offshore development that we know needs to happen. And that interest in time and the time periods you need to look at, that's my second key point. Again, thinking back to the sustainable blue economies, then you actually need to think about the short, the medium, and the long term. There's no point in just looking at the closest decision to you. You need to understand the implications, the trade-offs. What's going to happen tomorrow based on the decisions you make today? Are we thinking holistically? Are we thinking at the systems level around everything? So at the Crown Estate, the delivery route map is our way of doing that. It will form our delivery plan, but it's also going to be our way to partner with others. So we work very closely with lots of organisations, government departments at the moment. We're working with DEFRA on their MS-PRE initiatives. We work with the MMO on their great work around marine planning, work with NSTA around understanding CCS and the future of carbon storage. NESO are undertaking some really exciting spatial energy planning, working with those guys as well, and also the Welsh Government on their strategic resource areas. Loads and loads of work going on, but the route map is our way of trying to articulate our understanding of the opportunities, the trade-offs, in a consistent, transparent way. We need to be able to explain the reasons behind our thinking and how it all relates back to the evidence. And that's my third key point. There are so many organisations, so many government departments, so many stakeholders with an interest in the marine space. We need to collaborate, we need to share. Without that collaboration and sharing, if people don't understand other people's ideas, plans, why they're making this decision or thinking in that way, it's going to be impossible to pull together and really get through the amount of work we need to get through in the next 5 years. So that's the route map in terms of what we want it to be. In terms of how we go about delivering it, we are acutely aware of the pressures in the marine space. So there is a huge demand for space. We've looked across the sectors that we have a role in managing. We've concluded we need to do more in the next decade than has been achieved in the last century. Massive, massive opportunity, but massive challenges as well. We do this at a time when we know there are challenges around nature and biodiversity loss, and also challenges around delivery, supply chains, investments, bottlenecks. So the way we approach this at the Crown Estate, we look at our whole of seabed evidence base, and we model each sector. So we start with each sector, modeling it in its entirety as an individual entity, working out how that sector best fits in alongside all the other interests and users in the marine space. We then do that for all the sectors we have an interest in, and we bring it together into integrated scenarios. And that's where it gets really, really, really exciting and interesting for me. So this is stuff that's never been done before, certainly at the Crown Estate, never done before. So we can start to run integrated scenarios that test different themes. How do we deliver everything we need to deliver all the way out to 2050 with nature at the heart of it, and minimize the impact on other users and uses of the marine space? What does that look like? What are the trade-offs? How do we do that if we want to maybe turn the environmental dial right up? How do we do it if we want to avoid all the sensitive areas? How do we do it if we want to lower costs for consumers and get lower cost development? What does that look like? What does it look like if we want to minimize the use of space and have more co-location and be really efficient in what we do? So those scenarios, we can run hundreds and hundreds of scenarios. They all give us information. We assess and appraise those scenarios in a very consistent way. We look at all forms of value. So we have a role to return value to the Treasury in terms of pounds and pence, but we think about value at the Crown Estate as social value, environmental value, and the economic value more broadly to the nation. And that's where the route map comes in. We then have to take a view. We have to take a view on what we think the right things are in the right locations at the right times, and be able to share that view in a way that we can explain and evidence it. And that's what the route map should bring when we get there. It should be a set of pathways that show our view of the most optimal way to deliver what's needed in the marine space and why we think that. So I'll just finish with a slide that is illustrative Please note the word illustrative very big in the middle there. This is one of our 2050 scenarios. It's actually one of the really early ones, but it does a great job of illustrating it. And what we're seeing here is we've looked, as I said, across all sectors. We've fitted everything in according to the rules in that particular scenario. We've put nature at the forefront of what we're thinking. We looked through everything that Crown Estate has a responsibility in, so those are the bits of text on the slide, and also everything that we don't have a direct responsibility in, so that's the text sort of highlighted white boxes in the slide. And we understand how this scenario performs. And it's this, as I said, we want to get to. We want to be able to share something that says, we think this is the right thing. We think these are the reasons behind why we think that's right. So I take it all the way back to the beginning, and again, the question about the blue economy and developing in the most sustainable way while making sure we hit all of our priorities. I actually really think it is genuinely very, very, very conceptually simple. We need to think about everything, all sectors, nature. Can't just think about one thing, two things. We need to think over the short, medium, and long term. Can't just look at the next problem that's in front of you. And we need to share and collaborate. And if we get that right, then we're onto a good path. I'm also aware the reality is it's very, very difficult to do that. It's very complex. So the Marine Delivery Routemap is one of our ways at the Crown Estate that we want to try and offer something back to help. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jamie. I find this incredibly exciting and looking forward to seeing it develop further. Our next speaker is Lucy Greenhill from Howell Marine Consulting, who's going to talk about what is a sustainable blue economy and how do we make progress towards it. Lucy.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lucy Greenhill, and I lead our blue economy portfolio at HMC. And yes, I don't represent a sector, but I am going to talk about what a sustainable economy is and what we need to do to make progress towards one. So anyone who's engaged with the blue economy will know there's no one single definition out there. And I'm not going to describe the many definitions there are, but instead summarize some key differences in interpretation which can create confusion. So first of all, we have the traditional view of the blue economy, so also called the ocean or maritime economy. So this is all your economic activities at sea, so fishing, shipping, tourism, and emerging sectors like renewable energy and biotechnology. And this is a popular term with politicians and economists because it can be measured in terms of contribution to GDP and aligns with national economic ambitions. But the problem with this interpretation is that it doesn't promote change away from business as usual or really address the trajectory of environmental decline. So even though the blue in the blue economy should be enough, like the green economy, which somehow manages to keep the green as central to the concept, the European Commission, UNEP, WWF, and others have seen the need to define a sustainable blue economy. So this is all about striking a balance between economic growth, ecosystem health, and social equity. It emphasizes developing sustainable approaches to marine and coastal sectors, including decarbonizing shipping and sustainable fisheries management. And alongside this, taking action to recover nature, including through nature-based solutions. And this aligns with key frameworks such as the UN Sustainable Development Goals and supports integrating these into the ambitions of national governments. So at HMC, we've actually been working with UNEP, so the United Nations Environment Programme, for around 3 years now on their Sustainable Blue Economy Transition Framework, which should be published in the next month or so. So this framework moves us from a single statement definition and provides key goals which can guide a programme of transition across individual sectors. So we have a goal on ecosystems, a social goal on equity, one on climate, and a circular economy. And as outcome statements, they provide the basis of a framework for measuring progress, and the transition framework goes into detail about how this can be done. So to some, the sustainable blue economy approach does not go far enough, and instead are promoting a regenerative blue economy, as most recently set out by the IUCN. So this advocates for shifting our economic models to put biodiversity and climate at the center, embedding environmental externalities into decision-making, which would then drive the development of circular approaches and prioritize conservation and restoration of natural capital. So oil and gas activities are excluded from this model, with others only allowed if adapted. So this is purposely an ambitious vision of a blue economy and tests us with how radical and how fast we are prepared to be in actively diverting from the status quo, and supports important debates on how to really prioritize the environment and reconsider our approach to growth. So there are many definitions out there used by the World Bank, the OECD, and national governments, and I've put the government of Indonesia's definition there. And they generally include some or all of these words. But I've drawn out these three perspectives, from blue to sustainable to regenerative, to highlight some key differences in interpretation and provide food for thought in terms of whether we are doing enough. And while definitions are important, so like global negotiations, agreeing which words to include in which order, shows political intent and ambition, it stimulates debate and activates wider stakeholders. But these clusters of words and whatever order they're put in will always be theoretical, and more is needed to understand the practical change needed on the ground. So moving on from definitions, I offer 4 key insights into how to deliver sustainable outcomes for our oceans and coasts, with examples of how they are or could be approached in practice. And they're really about addressing changing how we do things and to help us think about how they might be reflected in the important work we're all engaged in. And actually, many of them echo strongly what Jamie presented just before. So number 1, we need to be looking at things in an integrated way. So as we're discussing, our current 2030 ambitions are demanding, with potential for conflict and a need for coordination. So clear policy direction means addressing trade-offs head-on and the difficult conversations needed about how to achieve multiple ambitious policy targets. In some cases, this might mean acknowledging that we can't have it all, but then being transparent in our prioritization and what has to give in order for other objectives to be achieved. And working together in new ways is essential to develop a coordinated approach and aligned strategies. So in practice, ideally, there's an overarching policy or strategy, and we see many examples of these globally, such as the various blue economy roadmaps, national ocean policies, Scotland's blue economy vision, the UK marine policy statement, although that's a bit outdated now. Well, whatever this instrument is called, the main thing is that it clarifies the overall direction of travel and incorporates different but interlinked commitments and goals, and provides the basis for cross-government working. And then marine planning is a critical delivery tool in this, which we've been hearing about, as this can take this integrated policy framework and then steer decision-making. And the development of Scotland's National Marine Plan 2 is really grappling with this just now. And the work of the Crown Estate, which we've just heard about from Jamie, is supporting this coordinated thinking, including helping us visualize future scenarios to then decide together how to manage them. And across the UK, we are seeing a push for strategic approaches to energy and to nature restoration, and bringing these strategic efforts together will be a key challenge going forward. So linking to the above, and we've heard a lot about this already today, and I wonder if system approaches will be the theme emerging. But we need to be looking at the full system, so the wider sociological system, or the system of people and nature, to explore the influence of policy and decision-making within it. Systems are really complex, and our understanding will never be perfect, but bringing a systems perspective to what we do helps explore how decisions and policies may overlap, to recognize and avoid unintended consequences, and to understand how efficiencies can be made, including through collaboration with others. So working with ICF, we recently supported a project for DEFRA, so the Marine and Fisheries Department, to understand how to deliver a vision for ocean sustainability, and this was really interesting. So similarly to, as Brendan was discussing earlier, we developed a participatory system map through iterative workshops to help DEFRA explore how policy decisions might lead to changes directly but also indirectly, identify actions to be taken to avoid negative consequences, and to understand where they can work with others more effectively. So this highlighted cross-cutting factors like data and evidence, which underpins all policy delivery and the opportunities for efficiencies there, as well as the cross-cutting nature of climate change, which affects everything and requires a whole system response. But then the really interesting bit of this for me, and sorry, it looks like the logos have moved around a bit, was then looking at the organizational change that will be needed to operate in a more system-based way. So taking that system map and thinking, well, what would need to change internally for us to reflect this in reality? So the key things here are shared vision and values to support alignment across departments, as well as changes in how policy is made, knowledge and data systems, staff training, and accountability. So this is really interesting and hopefully will lead to positive change. So the third insight to emphasize, and this really echoes everything, especially in Diana's talk this morning, it's not new, but it's fundamental to shifting how we do things. And it's about engaging a wide range of people, expanding beyond government to the people and communities affected by policy, including as many voices as possible at the right time. So in practice, some learning from the Diverse Values Project under the Sustainable Management of Marine Resources research program. Some insights here was about looking beyond marine policy to other drivers, including the just transition, well-being, even EDI, to understand synergies and pool resources and addressing social goals. It's about working more closely with local partnerships and voluntary organizations in a multi-level way, which we heard a lot about earlier, and clarifying decision-making so that the purpose of engagement and potential influence is understood, so that process literacy term that we're hearing about. And being more innovative in our public participation, including through arts-based methods and ways to support debate. So the fourth and final insight is that we need to be more learning-based, recognizing the complexity of the challenges we face in achieving a sustainable blue economy and building learning into our activities. So this means reflecting on our experience and being willing to make changes and adapt how we do things based on new understanding and being more experimental in order to learn more quickly. And in practice, most of us are involved in evaluation of some kind and all the MEL processes out there. And these provide frameworks and opportunity to learn. And the message here is to put more emphasis on the learning aspect of these. And I really like this phrase I heard recently from a learning specialist we're working with about the need to move from seeking to prove to seeking to improve. So about looking beyond results and targets to a learning-led approach, which emphasizes understanding how change happens in order to improve over time. And this is particularly valuable in a sustainable blue economy sense, where defining outcomes and being able to report against them is difficult. And we recently supported an independent evaluation of the World Bank's support for the blue economy over the last decade, which grappled with this. So exploring what the World Bank meant by a blue economy, as well as understanding whether they were steering progress towards one. So there isn't any one toolkit or approach in progressing towards a sustainable economy, so apologies for not delivering that. It'll be a non-linear process of change based on many nudges and shifts across the system. And we're all working towards sustainability of our oceans and coasts in some way. And I've set out some questions here to help reflect on how these approaches can become the norm in the way that we do things. So I won't read them all out, but integrated, how is this activity supporting greater coordination? How are we addressing trade-offs? What else is going on that we need to connect with? Systems-based, so thinking how are we promoting a system-based way of working and how can we internally reflect that? Being collaborative and participatory, and thinking about the frameworks you have in place to support learning and how you can emphasize the learning part in it. So, in summary, high-level definitions are useful and can promote political buy-in, but are less important in driving practical change. There is no blueprint for implementing a sustainable blue economy, and approaches will be different everywhere, and progress will be non-linear and messy. But the key is to really recognize this complexity and get comfortable being uncomfortable and take this on by operating in a more coordinated and integrated way, being more systems-based, participatory and collaborative, and recognizing that learning really matters and embedding this in everything that we do. Thanks so much for listening, and happy to answer questions, and come and see us at our panel.
Thank you so much, Lucy. That was incredibly rich and also challenging for people to change the way in which they do things quite so radically. To finish off these initial speakers, we've got Siobhan Browne from the Marine Management Organisation asking us, can we really build, or maybe she's answering, can we really build a wind farm in 2 years? Siobhan.
So, hi everyone, as the slide has said and Rachel's introduced me, I'm Siobhan Browne from the Marine Management Organisation, and I head up the Strategic Renewables Unit there, which is also known as the SRU, which is how I'll refer to it going forward, because otherwise it's a bit of a tongue twister. So as you're all aware, the title of this session is Meeting 2030 Targets Whilst Growing a Sustainable Blue Economy. I'm sure you're all familiar with the government targets for offshore wind, but just as a reminder, the aim is for 50 gigawatts offshore wind by 2030. We've of course heard this morning as well about the government aims to protect and enhance the natural environment as well. So in terms of this talk, I'm going to focus on the speed of offshore wind deployment to understand if we really can meet those 2030 targets whilst ensuring a sustainable marine environment. In terms of what I'll cover, I'm just going to very briefly cover what the SRU is and what we do, just for those of you who might not have heard of the team. I'll talk about a recent bit of analysis that the team has carried out to see where the holdups are in offshore wind development, and I'll really answer this key question about where we are, whether we really can build an offshore wind farm in 2 years. I'll talk about what the team's analysis has showed us in terms of where the process could be improved, and I'll briefly touch on a few projects that the team have been involved with to try and enhance offshore wind deployment. I'll finalise by highlighting some key points that have emerged from the team's work on deployment timelines. So just in terms of the team, we were established in 2021, so almost 4 years ago, which has flown past, and that was in response to the increasing drive for renewables deployment. As many of you will be aware, there's now a huge number of projects and programmes focusing on offshore wind, both before and as a result of the British Energy Security Strategy. The MMO was finding it was struggling to engage with all of those programmes and projects, and so the SRU was established to help with that. The team sits within our marine planning team, which we've heard lots about already today, but we work very much across the MMO with all teams that are involved in our renewables work, particularly our marine licensing teams, but also our evidence teams and our marine conservation teams. The key role of the team is to add value to the MMO's work on renewables. We don't get involved in day-to-day decision-making, but we do support strategic work on offshore wind farms. And a key role of the team is to work with our licensing colleagues to understand issues that are affecting multiple offshore wind farm cases to determine whether there are process improvements that we can make both within the MMO and in the projects and programs that we're working on. We very much aim as a unit to add value to the MMO's work in offshore renewables deployment through engaging in those strategic programs of work. And that's just a brief picture of some of the team members there, not all of them, but I will say it wasn't January, we're not that hardy. So as I mentioned, in this talk, I'm going to just talk about some recent analysis that the team has carried out. But first, why did we carry this out, and why that question about those 2 years of construction? So you might recall that during the election, there was a lot of criticism of the speed at which offshore wind is developed. We've heard from industry and seen through our own engagement that significant amounts of time is spent deliberating contentious issues through pre-application, examination, and in some cases, failing to reach agreement by decision stage. Particularly during the election and in the run-up to the election, we heard the phrase repeatedly, oh, if it weren't for delays with consenting and grid connection, an offshore wind farm could be built in 2 years. As a team, we really wanted to understand where the holdups are and if it really is feasible to meet that 2-year phrase. We recognise the need to understand what the problem actually is. In order to understand where the holdups are, the team analysed a range of data to understand the time taken for offshore wind development, from planning and development through to operation. The data shows, and there is some of it up on the slide, but I'll talk you through the highlights. On average, construction of an offshore wind farm does take roughly 2 years. However, there's always a however or a but. The work required during pre-construction, which includes site planning, project finance, and securing additional consents amongst other elements, means that actually that construction might be possible, but the whole process is just not going to happen in that 2-year time frame. The team's analysis demonstrated that since the first UK offshore wind farm was installed, the time taken from a lease award to deployment, and by that I mean a fully operational offshore wind farm, has seen a major increase from around 7 years in round 1 to a predicted 16 years in round 3. We have to think about why that might be, but actually in part that's due to design of round 3 leasing, which saw large areas leased for phased deployment, so different sectors coming forward at different time. However, even with this accounted for, it does appear that deployment times are increasing. In terms of capacity, though, round 3 wind farms are on average 10 times larger than round 1. And therefore, despite the increase in deployment time, we are seeing a reduction in the per gigawatt of capacity. So there's been up to a 90% reduction in that gigawatts when you look at it. A key finding from the team's analysis was that we need to look at the whole process and not individual stages to really understand where we can make improvements, as all offshore wind farm stages are linked. At the bottom there, you'll just see the kind of timeline that we were looking at when we did this analysis, and it very much demonstrated that it's all linked throughout the process. It was particularly noted that consenting builds on work carried out during the strategic planning and pre-application stages, and there is extensive work required post-consent and pre-construction, which is often where we see some of the hold-ups. The analysis carried out by the team shows that the facts about perceived delays in the planning consented stage of offshore wind deployment need to be set in the context of the overall time taken for all of the stages in offshore wind, how those have changed over time, and therefore where there is most potential for reducing delays. So in reality, in terms of answering my question, we are unlikely to ever build a wind farm in 2 years, but there is scope to improve the speed of deployment whilst considering the environment and other marine users. These are some key points I'll come back to. So in terms of improving the process, the stages with most potential for accelerating deployment or changing the approach that we identified as a team were pre-application and pre-construction. It's worth noting, though, that actually the measures to speed up these parts of the process might actually happen elsewhere in the process. So it's during the pre-application stage that sites are assessed for their impact, both environmental and social. There is scope to improve elements of this part of the process, particularly through learning from previous developments and ensuring that evidence is fed back into the process. This is also a vital stage to involve others, which I think we've heard repeatedly this morning. As I mentioned, I'm just going to highlight a couple of examples of where the team has been engaged in this area to try and improve this part of the process through pre-application. So the team's been working very much with industry and others to enable more consistent survey data collection and better use of monitoring from operational offshore wind farms to inform development of new projects. This very much actually thinks about what we've got happening, how we can use the data we're collecting and inform new developments. The SRU have led an evidence project to map the sensitivity of the under 12-metre fishing fleet in the east to offshore wind. This project is going to help us understand the spatial distribution of fishing activity and fishery-specific sensitivity of the under 12-metre fleet. This will help us identify and fill outstanding evidence gaps regarding sustainable offshore wind deployment from a fisheries perspective. We've heard it repeatedly this morning, and I think it's clear to everyone involved in the marine space that there's a lot of competing interests in our busy marine space. To facilitate appropriate offshore wind development, the MMO contributes to strategic planning, including through our role as the marine planning body in England, providing support to the DEFRA-led cross-government marine spatial prioritisation programme, and inputting to NESO's strategic spatial energy plan. So there's an awful lot going on in this space, and we've heard a bit already from Jamie today. The SRU also engaged with government and industry programmes to support improvements to pre-application, including through DEFRA's Offshore Wind Environmental Improvement Package, the Crown Estate's Offshore Wind Evidence and Change work, and through involvement in the Fishing Liaison with Offshore Wind and Wet Renewables Group, which seeks to foster good relations between the fishing and offshore renewable energy sectors. The other area I mentioned that we think we can really improve in terms of the process and increasing deployment is around pre-construction. So in England, there are around 14.5 gigawatts of offshore wind currently in pre-construction. When you think about it, that's actually the same as the amount we've also got developed already. So if we can speed up this phase of the process, there's a real opportunity to meet our 2030 targets. The team's analysis showed that an awful lot happens in this phase, from condition discharge right through to financial decisions for developers. And there is significant scope for improvements and potential time savings in this stage. The SRU have been involved in a number of pieces of work to improve this phase. One area that many people are familiar with relates to grid and improving the connection, and this is a key focus at the moment for government and industry. The SRU are supporting this work via working groups and facilitating engagement with fisheries. In addition, improvements in data collection and approaches for construction could improve the time taken for issue and discharge of consent conditions, thereby speeding up this pre-construction phase. The SRU is currently undertaking an evidence project focused on standardising the reporting of post-consent monitoring, which will lower the time needed in the pre-construction phase to reach agreement on what is required, which should then speed up that part of the process. We've also been working to manage underwater noise levels, including through working with the oil and gas industry to manage noise levels and through supporting the establishment of an underwater noise coordination forum for multiple industries working across our marine space. So, in conclusion, our analysis showed that it is a period either side of consenting that could be accelerated to improve the rollout of offshore wind in the coming years. Several programmes are underway to deliver these improvements, and the SRU are heavily involved on behalf of the MMO. A key point that the team identified through our analysis is that acceleration needs to be viewed holistically with a focus on reducing overall deployment time and project attrition. Without careful consideration, accelerated deployment could lead to increased cumulative impacts on both the marine environment and existing marine users, as well as putting pressure on supply chains, government finances, and regulatory and industry resources. To realise the potential of offshore wind and ensure all are brought into the process, I really think it would be helpful to move beyond the language of barriers. We often hear that that's a barrier to offshore wind. However, this can be quite a divisive term, and it only comes from one perspective. One person's barrier might well be another person's opportunity. We should instead emphasise enablers and focus on delivering for multiple interests. So the 3 key points I'd like you to take away from this talk are, there is scope to increase the speed of offshore wind deployment to meet 2030 targets, but we're not going to be building a wind farm in 2 years anytime soon. It's vital that improvements to the process are considered holistically with all marine users and the environment in mind, and it's crucial that we work together to achieve this. We should move beyond the language of barriers and instead emphasise enablers and delivering for multiple interests.
Thank you so much, Siobhan. That was fantastic. I'd now like to invite all our speakers and panellists to come and sit in your numbered seats. It's very important everyone sits in the right one. So Jamie in number 1, Lucy number 2, Siobhan number 3, Sam 4, Peter 5, Chris, and then Tom. Make sure that the right attribution is given on the live stream. So this is for those at home as much as anything else. Thank you very much. I'd like to welcome our additional panellists. So going from this end, we've got Tom Ash, who's Senior Policy Officer at the Wildlife and Countryside Link, Chris Ranford, who's Chief Executive of the Cornish Fish Producers Organisation, Peter Barham, who's Chair of the Seabed User and Developer Group, and Samuel Wrobel, who's Senior Marine Policy Officer at the RSPB. So you can see we've got a very diverse lineup here, and the question we're going to ask each of them to address first is just simply the biggest one that we are addressing today. Can we meet the 2030 target while growing a sustainable blue economy? I think I'll start at this end with Tom, if that's okay.
Sure. I think the starting point for that question has to be that nature in the last few decades has been pummeled. We are a long way off 30 by 30. We are a long way from good environmental status, and the pressures have piled up. And what we're looking at up to 2030 is potentially more pressures, not fewer. Offshore wind is scaling up, and other industries are not looking to scale down. So how do we manage that? I think with increased focus on offshore wind, we have got a moment when there is an opportunity to change how we do things. But that really has to be a transformative change and focus on restoring nature and not just managing the further decline of nature. But that's not going to happen if we just do the status quo, or if we let the market decide things. We really need big intervention from government to plan things strategically, manage those pressures, and reduce those pressures while we scale up renewables, or we won't meet those 2030 nature targets.
Thank you very much. Chris.
Thanks. 2030 targets from a fishing industry's point of view, I think no doubt a challenge, but the fishing industry loves a challenge, certainly from Cornwall, so challenge accepted. And I guess just to set some context in relation to the talks that have already happened and the whole idea of the 2 days. From a fishing industry's point of view, with the new Labour manifesto, there's absolutely no mention of fishing whatsoever. So from our point of view, that's extremely challenging to start with, and kind of crazy in a way that we haven't been picked up. Given all the detail that we're talking about today and all the ambition for the marine space, to miss fishing out is certainly going to set a bigger challenge than we had already. To second that, I'll get the doom and gloom out of the way and I'll come on something a bit more interesting. Fishing's actually not a statutory consultee, so it doesn't actually have to be consulted in the marine planning process. Spoken a lot about fishing this morning, great to hear it being spoken about by so many different people in so many different ways. But actually, from a formal point of view, it doesn't have to be recognised in that planning process. Its input doesn't have to be accepted. Things can happen without listening to it. So again, a big challenge. On to something a bit more interesting or positive from a Fisheries Act, Joint Fisheries Statement, 2 really important pieces of legislation and a sort of framework really. Post-Brexit, there is good recognition of the role of fishing, fisheries management plans, the role and contribution fishing can make to coastal communities. Obviously, it's a food production industry. Lots of good recognition in there, so that's certainly something we're latching onto and working with. We're hearing the Secretary of State making a lot more reference to food security as national security, and our conversations with the Minister in terms of food security is that fishing is very much a part of that. So again, that's something really positive that we can get behind. Cornwall last year produced 40 million meals from seafood, 40 million protein portions, shall I say. That's enough to feed every single person in the entire southwest population one seafood meal every week for an entire year. So I think we make a good contribution to food security. But from our point of view, rather than worry or sort of see where we're not included or not recognised in the manifesto, we're doing a lot of work. So through my organisation, we've collected a huge amount of evidence, a huge amount of data. Fishermen have an immense amount of knowledge, experience, generational understanding of the sea and the marine space. And actually, I think to get to 2030 targets, that's going to have to be listened to. It's going to have to be accepted. That sort of voice is going to be integral in terms of getting to where we want to get to in such a short amount of time. And two really quick snapshot examples of that. Our work that we've done in reference to Jamie's presentation about the Crown Estate, working with fisheries, we've been heavily involved in everything that's happening in the Celtic Sea in terms of floating offshore wind. And I think we're sort of revolutionizing really how that can play out by bringing fishing in right at the start of the process in terms of marine planning, not waiting for it to get too late or get in the hands of a consultant or a developer. It's actually having that conversation very early on, using our knowledge, our data to smooth that process through. We'll probably definitely get to where we want to get to a lot quicker that way. And there's lots of work we're doing in terms of fisheries management plans, certainly from a Cornish point of view, really engaging and taking that head on and bringing through some of the first bits of legislation post-Brexit, which is all co-designed, as we've been speaking about today. But I would say industry is actually leading a lot of that. A lot of the good things that are coming through are coming out of the words of fishermen themselves. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Peter.
I've been told to use this one.
Go ahead.
Okay, it works. Hi, I'm not Jane Godwin. She's giving evidence to the Environment Audit Committee, so you've got me instead. The answer to the question, can we meet the 2030 targets whilst growing a sustainable blue economy? And the answer is yes. Because if we weren't optimistic, we'd be planning to fail. So it's as simple as that. To expand on that a bit, I've decided to use some of the quotes from the conference so far today, because I think that reflects that we know what the answers are. All we might need to do is work on them. So the first one, and the obvious one, is from Minister Hardy this morning, who said, quote, "We need to be supporting growth and nature." So we do need to worry about bats and newts, and also every other bit of biodiversity. Michelle Willis followed that with a statement where she said, "We need to see regulators as enablers," and Siobhan followed through a bit on that, which is great, because the simple fact is that we need to work together, and I don't need to say anything more about participation and collaboration and partnership. It's all been said, not just this morning, but in previous conferences for years and years. But one of the key points, and it's a point that we've recognised at this conference in the last couple of years, and it's really made by Amy and others, Amy Pryor and others in the panel discussion, which is that we need to act, and we need to act now. We have a biodiversity crisis, we have an energy crisis. If it was an energy question, we could say, well, we've got time to look at it. But it's not, it's an energy crisis, we need to act. So there we go. But the simple fact is we're not going to address things like climate change without industry. That's apparent and it's obvious. And equally, industry is very supportive, certainly the marine industries within SUDG, of contributing to nature restoration. And there's a lot going on there. And there's a lot of initiatives, and one of which I think was mentioned this morning by the Minister and announced later on, which is the move towards strategic compensation and the Marine Recovery Fund, which industry will pay for. And that's great. That's actually now public. We got the email this morning, so that's a good news. And the other one is that we're also working very closely with DEFRA, but also RSPB, Wildlife Trust and so on, to develop strategic targets for net gain and how those can be delivered. So there's two real key areas where industries can contribute to nature recovery. Jamie said in his talk, on one of his slides, there's a lovely quote. It said, "Nature is at the core of decisions," which it should be. I don't think anybody would argue that, and we're working towards this. And Siobhan, you said we work towards strategic, not piecemeal approaches. In other words, we're all saying the same things. All we've got to do is agree them and then act on them. And my last point is the fact that to enable us to act, we've got initiatives. The one I'm particularly thinking of is OWEC, the Offshore Wind Evidence for Change Programme with the Crown Estate, where it's not just looking for evidence, but it's looking for actions arising from those evidence. And most important of all is that all those have an impact. And if we do that, then we will make decisions and we should reach those targets. And I said all that without using the word integrate once.
Thank you very much, Peter. And last but not least, Sam.
Yes is my answer, because we have to. I'm trying to share the optimism of today, and I think a lot of those answers are coming forward in everyone's talk so far, and as we've been kind of plucked on all of those key bits just then by Pete, the answers are there in front of us. But we have to be transformative. We have to see huge scale change, and we have to have that matched ambition for that nature emergency as we have got for these other emergencies and these other crises coming forward. And that's starting to come forward. We saw that with some of the announcements this morning, and that's an inkling of what is possible in that space, I think. But it's about how do we front load that system? How do we bring those environmental considerations to the forefront of what we're trying to do? It comes into the heart of things, as Jamie was saying. How do we bring that to where we need it, and how do we deal with that as a whole picture? We've never known now, we've never known as much as we do now. We're at a point of absolute as much knowledge as we're going to get. We've got lessons learned. We know when wind farms have been put in bad places. We know when we've put too much emphasis on compensation measures that aren't delivering. We've got the best available knowledge, and we were talking about in the first session this morning. We have the best available knowledge that we have now, so let's use it. Let's start implementing that and start driving that for action. I think key for 2030, this is a really exciting year. 5 years, I don't know where 2020 went. We're already halfway through that. But key for 2030 is recovery. And I really want to try and emphasize that over the next couple of days. It's not just about protection. We have been declining for decades. If we limit ourselves to protection, we flatline at the bottom. We now need to drive recovery and push that forward. Things like strategic compensation are valuable and really important tools for that consenting and moving us forward and enabling, and seeing nature as an enabler in that space. But it gets us back to the baseline. So how do we keep driving that forward and bring that up? And I think seabirds are a really key example of that. And we often get asked, why should we care about seabirds? Why should we care about seagulls? But the answer is they are poignant to this question. Can we hit those targets? They are highest risk of extinction, and they are the furthest from target. They are the only indicator of good environmental status that is not only failing, but moving the opposite direction. And they are our indicators. They're the canary in the coal mine. They're the ones saying, the fact that they're failing, the food systems are failing, the prey availability, the habitats that all of those species rely on are failing, and we have an ecosystem collapsing underneath them. Let's listen to that and drive that forward. And lastly, it's kind of on these points around how Siobhan kind of finished up there. I think the language around trade-offs, the language around barriers is really harmful to how we can progress this. We're on about enablers. How do we push this forward? How do we use what we've got to drive this? And I think that's how we catalyze on this change and use a new attitude towards that of catalyzing change for healthy resiliencies.
Thank you very much. So we've heard violent agreement from 7 extremely different panellists that, yes, we want to meet the 2030 targets, and yes, we want to support a blue economy, and we can, subject to a really long list of conditions and things that have to be true. I hear radical collaboration being top of the list of those things, so thinking very differently about how we work together as a kind of wide range of organisations to get that change. And also systems. I liked what Lucy said about we need to work in a much more systems approach way in order to do this. So I think before going to audience questions, I've got one question, which is what, and this is for any of the panellists who would like to answer it, what one single thing can we do differently now that will unlock radical collaboration and systems change in order that we can deliver that? Jamie.
For me, we don't spend enough time in the same room. So we have a good breadth of expertise in this room, a lot of people, but quite often we find ourselves in more bilateral conversations Bilateral with government, bilateral with a developer, or bilateral with somebody who has another interest in the marine space, and round we go. So for me, if we could spend a little bit more time really focusing on some of those issues, collaboratively, as in across government, across industry, across stakeholders, across organisations like the MMO, organisations like ourselves, I think that would allow us to be a bit quicker in what we're trying to achieve.
I just wanted to build on what Jamie was saying, because I was going to say something similar, but make it a bit more focused on developing a shared vision of what we want the seas to look like. Because often if you have that conversation with everyone in the room and say, well, actually, what does everyone want here? What are we willing to accept? And then design a vision of what if you call it the blue economy or whatever it might be, what does that vision of ocean sustainability look like? I think using that as a focus of a conversation and getting everyone in the same room would be a kind of a quick win and just start the conversations that we need to have. So.
Anyone else?
I just think we've done a lot. This isn't something that's about to happen. It's not all in the future. We've done so much, and there's so many lessons learned. I think it's just a really important time to quickly reflect and actually then learn from the past and actually see what we can do in this immediate future. Feels like there's an urgency, no doubt about it. But this is happening today. This is happening yesterday. Certainly from my point of view, there's huge lessons learned from past experiences in terms of the Crown Estate and the fishing industry. And that's what we're trying to do, is actually really try and shift things around. But I think across everything, we do need to learn lessons from where we've come from.
Tom?
I think 2025 has to be the year of policy implementation, especially policies that many of us agree on. I mean, we've worked closely with SUDG on planning reform, and there's been so many things mentioned by the previous government and now again by this government, and we heard that from Member Hardy this morning about marine spatial prioritisation, Marine Recovery Fund, and they've just been on paper for so many years. And if we don't have many of those things in place by the end of 2025, then we're not going to get to 2030. So I think we all need to keep asking for that to make sure that government hears that message that, yes, there might be room for more strategies at some point, but the priority now is implementation, number one.
I can't add to that.
Fantastic. Right, let's go to questions out here. David, do you want to come first? David's got the Slido questions, but needs a microphone as well. Can we take two from your Slido questions?
There's a lot of questions here about directly to the Crown Estate, so I think they've been upvoted quite a lot, so we need to address those, I think. So I'll just read out two, and then there's groups here around ownership, another group around planning, but I'll stick to the ownership first. How can truly democratic and community-driven local decision-making be possible if 55% of the shoreline is the property of one owner? And just to follow on from that around ownership, the Crown Estate owns 65% of the Welsh seabed, providing millions in annual revenue. Wales doesn't receive this. Is it time to devolve the Crown Estate in Wales? No personal interest there at all.
Thank you for those questions.
Who wants to take this one? Thanks, Dave. So, I saw the questions on Slido, actually. And I think, just as an observation, I think if we can capture the question on Slido, I don't know if we can or not, but then really happy to take some of these away as well. But for the two there, in terms of the slight monopoly ownership of the coastal area, I think it depends on how open your landowner is to the conversations and what also we have customers at the Crown Estate, we have tenants, and what the tenants are using that land for. So we grant rights for lots and lots of things in the offshore and coastal space. I think we are very clear in our strategy from our board all the way down through our business into our marine business of that we want to operate in a way that considers all forms of value. It needs to be collaborative. It needs to be done. Our business needs to be done in a way that doesn't just think about the money that we return back to Treasury. So I think if we approach that in the right way and we instill that mindset in the right way in our tenants and our customers, then there is a collective that can come to the table that can have those more community-based conversations. So that's what I think about the first question. In terms of the devolution question, so we returned 1.1 billion to the Treasury last year. We have no choice where that goes from us. It goes back into the Treasury, into central government, and then various things happen with devolved nations. So we focus very hard on our remit to make sure that we're, as I said, maximising all forms of value in terms of that return that we make as well. We think equally about the space that we manage across English, Welsh, and Northern Irish waters. We don't favour a particular geography. We try and reflect the needs of policy, the needs of targets, the needs of governments. We try and reflect the way that regulators operate. We're not a regulator ourselves. So it's something that is out of our hands, but we're very focused on making sure we're returning the most value we can so that that value can be spread out in the way that's best.
Thank you. Do any other panellists have views on community participation? Yeah, Lucy.
I was just going to mention, and I'm not trying to support JB's case, but there's also, I'm aware of the work that through the Diverse Values Project, we worked with Tristan a little bit, and I know that the Crown Estate are looking to expand the concept of what value is from a social perspective, so moving away from just revenue, but actually what does prosperity mean for communities, and then asking those questions about how you represent that spatially in planning, which really isn't easy to do, but I think it's quite progressive that they're looking into that, taking that perspective on things.
Siobhan.
Yeah, I was just going to say as well, I think also there's a need for government and the Crown Estate to lead by example in terms of that engagement and engagement with localities as well, because I think that will really add value and demonstrate to other landowners as well that actually, and industry, that actually what we really should be doing is getting those local people involved in those discussions. So I think there's definitely that option to lead by example as well.
Sam.
Yeah, I think questions like that are actually really healthy, and I think they should be asked. And sorry, James, I know that is a grilling on your part, but that's what we should be doing. I think business as usual isn't working, and I think questions like that are really healthy, and to question how we do things, and is it the right way, how's it working? And we've seen real good progress with the Crown Estate recently on nature and kind of embedding that, and that's really positive, and I think that sets an example of where they're heading and towards things, and so more questioning like that, I think, is a good thing.
Thank you. Peter.
I mean, Jamie said it all with regard to the money that the Crown Estate collects and puts back to Treasury. I can't add to that. But what I think is important to understand, whether in Wales or England or, as it used to be, Scotland, is that the Crown Estate just doesn't take revenue, it actually invests in industries as well. And that investment is really important in creating growth and in creating jobs and the whole process of regeneration in coastal communities where we know it's needed. So, and from the social point of view, I think that's a message that needs to be really got across, is that people should rightly have a role to play in their futures, but they need to understand that there are other things going on as well that help to drive that in terms of growth. So I think the Crown Estate play a really important role in that.
Yeah. Chris.
I think whoever the decision maker is on what's happening in terms of marine planning, certainly from a Crown Estate angle, it's all about listening from that local level, that community level. We've got to actually really understand what those voices are saying and what they're telling, because it's not just potentially resistance, it's actually the knowledge and the information those voices hold. Often we get data evidence played back to us as a fishing industry. Somebody else has obtained it, translated it, made an assumption, and then puts it on the table and asks for a conversation, consultation, debate, or whatever. But actually listening to the fishing industry's own translation of that data set, explaining what it's doing, why it's doing it, why it's not going to a certain place, its knowledge of the international fishing fleets operating in our waters that might not be on a data set. So I would say, yeah, anyone, whoever is in that position of decision-making power, has to have that deep understanding of what that voice is telling them and actually listen.
Thank you. Tom, do you want to come in?
Nothing to add on that one.
I'm going to try for a question from balcony. Any questions from the balcony? Or is everybody typing their questions into Slido? No? Okay, any questions from the floor in that case? Got one over there. Yeah.
Yeah, hi everyone. It's Bryce Stewart from the Marine Biological Association and the University of Plymouth. Just looking at the big question, and this is for anyone who wants to address this. Do you think there's enough of a common understanding of what the 2030 targets actually mean in reality? And do you think there's a danger that people have different interpretations of that, and that some groups might claim that we've met the targets? Thinking of MPAs, we've already got 38% in MPAs around the UK. And do you think, therefore, there needs to be more work done to sort of build that common agreement or that common understanding of what we're actually aiming for?
Great question. Any more? Could take a second one from the floor at the same time. One back there. Oh, yeah. Gentleman with his hand up back there.
Thank you. Hitting up the back here. 2 Aussies in a row. What a lucky audience. Wow. So, late last week, the Parliament, UK government dropped or didn't vote on the Climate and Nature Bill. Didn't go to a vote. It's a private member's bill. Everyone loves the target. It's kind of like what Bryce is saying, actually. Everyone loves the target. They're in the future. They're a problem to solve over time. But the Climate and Nature Bill is quite interesting in that it proposed legally binding, much more shorter-term milestones and reporting. It promoted a joint nature and climate reporting mechanism. And interestingly, it promoted climate and nature assemblies, citizen assemblies, to help guide those visions, of which one, I won't name him, but a Scottish Conservative Member of Parliament described as anti-democratic, which is a quite interesting take on citizens' assemblies. So what do you think is the significance of this bill going down the plug hole, maybe never to return, since we love targets so much?
Thank you. So, 2 quite big questions. Firstly, do we all agree on what the 2030 success actually looks like? And secondly, does it matter that the Climate and Nature Bill has been put on the shelf for the time being? They're probably quite linked, actually, aren't they? Any views on either of those things? Yes.
Yeah, jumping on that first one, and I think definitely we need to think about more join up across them, and I think of this thing around target fatigue. So many targets. We've had targets for decades. We've missed targets for decades. 2030, a lot of these are building to one point. And it comes back to that point kind of we were talking about earlier around what does good look like? Where are we trying to get to? And actually a vision for that is going to be really beneficial. And Bryce, you mentioned around kind of the MPA target of, I think that is how we're going to unlock that is there is a target for MPAs. There is dispute over kind of how we're meeting that and if we're meeting that and in what, how effective that is. And if we kind of look back to what good looks like, it's how we picture that together. And is it delivering what it needs to do? Because that should be the outcome, not how many, it's what is it delivering and is it working? And that kind of comes back to this, a lot of us in this room talk about the nature and climate emergency, but do we see that reflected in the targets? Do we actually see an energy target reflecting the fact that there is an opportunity to catalyse change to bring them together? And I think that is a really good question because I think that is the bit that needs looking at and it needs raising to the attention at the top of bringing those together.
Peter.
I'm not sure what I think about the nature of the targets. What I do know is that we have a clear set of targets in the sense of what we need to do to achieve good environmental status. And we are working at the moment in a climate where I think we've failed, people will quote better than me, I think we've failed 11 out of 15 descriptors. There is a lot of work to be done. So the target setting, I think, comes from government through its assessment, through the UK Marine Strategy Programme, strategy work, etc. To that end, if we accept those targets, and I'll take your point about whether we should question them, but if we accept those targets, then there are things we can do to say, well, can we achieve those targets? So the work that, as I said earlier, the work we're currently doing on strategic targets, marine net gain, and the work that Dickon's doing for DEFRA, in setting a framework for marine net gain, is all based around net gain targets achieving GES or contributing towards GES. On the second question, I have always been a big fan of citizens' juries and citizens' assemblies, regardless of whatever Scottish MPs might think. I think they're great examples of local democracy and more power to their elbow, really.
Anyone else? I'll just stray beyond my chair's brief and say there's nothing to stop the existence of citizens' assemblies without legislation, and there's nothing to stop government thinking systemically and thinking about these things together without legislation. So perhaps there's an opportunity to move beyond a possible bit of legislation and just make sure they do it anyway. That's a bit more nimble as well than waiting for legislation to get through the House. Next question, Slido. Oh yes, slide over there.
Another public question on Slido. What does nature-based solutions mean in relation to offshore development? Can you give an example where nature-based solutions will reduce environmental impacts of development?
Do another one as well.
Sorry. Another question here, really, going back to the planning question with the Crown Estate, although these can be answered by anybody, really. The Crown Estate and the MMO appear to have the same aims and approaches. How does the Crown Estate route map differ from the MMO marine plans? And I suppose, in brackets, has a merger been considered?
Shall I pass to the Crown Estate and the MMO first for that second question? Siobhan, do you want to try?
Yes, so I think I'd basically say that we have very different remits in terms of what we're trying to do. So the MMO is it's a statutory marine planner for the UK government. So that's very much what our role is doing. And I'll pass on to Jamie to talk a little bit more about the Crown Estate, but I would very much say that we're working together, but we've got very different and separate remits. But although we work closely together, we are separate. We're doing different things for different reasons with various statutory purposes, but I'll pass to Jamie for anything further.
Yeah, just build on that. So, yeah, so MMO, statutory marine planner, regulator, licensing. We are looking at, through the route map, how we then create delivery. So we work in the context of government policy. We're not trying to set policy, that's government. We're not trying to be a regulator, that's not us. We are an organisation that provides and grants space rights to the seabed that allows things to happen. Said we're trying much harder to do that in a much more rounded way in recent times, and the route map is our vehicle to try and do that. What we do share between us, the MMO, NSTA, NISO, all the other organisations that have some sort of formal role in making things happen, is a need for evidence, is a need for information, is a need for good consultation, good partnership. And that's really what we're trying to enable here. So we will work absolutely closely with the MMO and help share the insights that we have from our information. We'll also then listen and take the MMO's outputs and reflect, if stuff comes out in marine planning that we need to reflect in the way that we think about delivery, we'll absolutely do that as well. So very separate remits, and I think that's probably why a merger hasn't been considered.
Thank you. Tom?
Yeah, with all due credit to great work that both organisations do, I think the question gets at something really important, which is there are a lot of overlapping jurisdictions in the marine space and a lot of different plans and all really great work going on. But it has been a gaping hole in recent years in terms of marine planning, which is central government. And I think the approach taken originally was let the market decide where stuff goes. And it's become clear to everyone, and there's been amazing work to correct that and say that is not the approach we can take, but we still don't have a marine spatial prioritization plan. That's what we need to reconcile these things, because it needs to have, and this is something that no other organization apart from central government can do, is actually have the power to affect decision making. Because unless you've got something that actually has the power to say, right, that goes there, these two can go in the same place, these two can't, it's all really good evidence, but it doesn't have that bite. So I think that's what we're missing to really bring everything together. And that has to talk to everyone. It shouldn't just be government taking that decision by themselves, but we do need that.
Anybody else on this?
Yeah, I guess from a stakeholder point of view, definitely not suggesting a merger, but a simplified process would be welcomed. I mean, I think from a Cornish fishing industry point of view, we're fortunate to be organised through the organisation I work for. There's a good history there of how we engage, how we do things, the wealth of data, evidence that we actually hold there, in the way that we can actually play that back and engage in whatever the process is, whatever the situation is. But certainly as you go further around the coast, there's going to be areas that are going to be much more spread out, fragmented in how they actually engage with both the MMO, the Crown Estate, in terms of all things marine spatial planning, fisheries management. It's a huge ask of either an individual business, a small community. So if there's a way of simplifying that, at least to recognise those people have got jobs to do and they actually need to make a living, as well as then contribute to this big picture thinking, that there's certainly a recognition of that, and we should find a more simplified way to do things.
Peter?
I think they're two very different organisations with different jobs. But what I would say is that work that the Crown Estate have done through the route map, etc., must be of incredible benefit to assisting the MMO in doing its obligation of developing marine plans. It's as simple as that, as far as I'm concerned. Do you want me to say something about nature-based solutions?
Give me some examples, thank you.
There's a lot in terms of how you design things, how you construct things, how you carry out compensatory actions to make sure that you reduce the impacts of nature. I've got a lot of personal experience of working in the ports industries to recreate or restore salt marshes and mudflats as compensation for port development, usually in quite large multipliers. But it's whether you see nature as environment or nature. If you mean nature as in nature restoration, then clearly there need to be actions that contribute to nature and restoration. So again, Tom, that's why I would really welcome the ministerial announcement this morning about strategic compensation and the fact that there'll be a marine recovery fund, because that will need to set clear targets that industry can achieve. So that's the straight nature-based. But there's also so many environmental things going on as well. You know, we've got better communications as a result of subsea cables. You know, we've got better transport because of more sustainable shipping and so on and so forth. So if Jen was here, she'd say that there's a variety of ambitions for improving things through the way that industry works. But there are great examples of nature-based solutions.
Tom?
Yeah, just on that, I think nature-based solutions are fantastic for some things and not so much for others. So you're talking about strategic compensation. I think done in certain ways, not only, and this is of the essence of nature-based solutions, can benefit nature and also people. You know, talked about salt marsh, that can help with storing carbon, flooding, so on. However, some of our member organisations at Link are working on species like cetaceans where there is no compensation. You just simply cannot compensate for damage to cetacean habitats. So then you have to think it's more difficult, but it's just as equally as important, because cetaceans are an important part of the ecosystem. They also play a role in circulating nutrients, storing carbon, but you can't compensate. So I think we have to be aware of where we can do a win-win and where it's much more difficult, and we have to think about the first stage of the mitigation hierarchy, which is avoiding those impacts. For example, the work's being done by the government on offshore noise.
I agree entirely with you.
Yeah, completely agree. And I think kind of bringing this back to our question of meeting 2030 targets is, I see a compensation and the role of nature-based solutions in some of those examples really key over the next 5 years. You know, we've got over 90 gigawatts of offshore wind in our planning system, whether that's through consent or planning or all of these extra bits and bobs, which is almost double that 2030 target. I know there are other ways and, you know, other considerations that we have there. But the compensation element, the nature-based solutions, is a real key to enabling that delivery. And I think, as we've been talking about the announcements this morning and things coming forward, it can really see nature as an enabler. It allows the consent of wind farms when it's used in that space. And I think there are some fantastic examples if we're considering the life cycle of species. We don't want to be confined to what's easy. Thinking about, coming back to the question that asked for specific examples, if we're thinking about artificial nesting structures for offshore wind farms, we don't yet know if that is a successful compensation measure, and it confines us to that breeding component. Well, let's think beyond that. Think about the islands that they're nesting on, thinking about the colonies, the beach nesting areas, thinking about out at sea, the offshore areas, the food availability. Let's think beyond that, and that's how we piece this together, and that's where we're going to see the wins. It's thinking about, in terms of seabirds and speaking from that experience, they need 3 things: a place to breed, a place to feed, and plenty of food. So if we can combine those, we can see some action and real action for consenting. Beyond 2030, that's where we absolutely need that marine spatial prioritisation, that avoidance. That is what is crucial, so that we're not sat here again in 10 years' time going, well, how do we meet the 2040 target? Or, you know, whatever it's going to be. So that's how I see splitting this up and separating it.
Thank you. So I've heard, in terms of specific examples, salt marsh, and I've heard artificial nesting structures. Anyone else with some examples of nature-based solutions and what they actually are? I love that fact that we need to explore this question further in the future, I say. There's a gentleman with his hand up just there.
Will Manning from the EA again, and I should have introduced earlier, but I'm the national contact in flood and coastal erosion risk management for the Habitat Compensation Restoration Programme. And for over 20 years, that's been doing strategic compensation, offsetting or compensating for the impact on the Natura 2000 network from coastal squeeze. And Poster 8 is one that we put together for that programme. So there's quite a lot of experience of delivering these big realignments around the coast over the last 20 years, working with a lot of partners in conservation bodies, in industry, regulators working actually in DEFRA, and also willing landowners, which is a big thing that we need to consider here. As Sam rightly pointed out, that compensation is that running to stand still against the 90s baseline set by the HABS regs. So one of the things, taking a leaf out of Peter's book and quoting from earlier, Minister Hardy mentioning transitioning through into co-design and co-delivery. How can that EA's publicly funded habitat compensation programme work with the industry sat on stage and the plans being set out on stage to come together and deliver beyond that compensatory requirement and achieve the wider restoration and recovery aims of the UK government?
Thank you. Let's just do that question. Any views on integrating the EA's existing compensation programme? Lucy.
I don't have a very detailed answer to that specific, but it points to a really broader point that, and I mentioned in my presentation. There's a rapid developing discussion around nature restoration and what we need to do to restore nature. And I've heard in many different arenas now that we need a strategic approach to nature restoration, and they're looking at that in Scotland. Thinking about that from a Welsh perspective, it's coming out of some of the marine net gain work that we're doing, and it's just like we can only look at this in a coordinated way if we've actually got some overarching vision and kind of framework of what we're actually aiming at in terms of recovering the environment and including across the coastline as well, because I know in Wales we did some work there, and it's not just starting with your marine habitats and to recover those, because actually at the coast they have been doing a lot already on that front for compensation for flood risk. So yeah, all these really important discussions around strategic approaches, it needs to be a really strategic approach to nature restoration across the UK, I think, land and sea.
Peter.
Will, I'm going to try and answer your question without using the word integration. I don't like it. But the simple fact is that we've now had 3 or 4 generations of shoreline management plans, and those really need to be setting out strategic approaches to coastal management, where we should hold the line, where we should retreat the line, so on and so forth. And it's always been my contention, as you know, I was heavily involved with shoreline management plans when I was in the agency. It's always been my contention that we should set those out very clearly, not see managed realignment areas as places for discussion, but for places where we will carry out managed realignment to get better flood defences, and then start to look for industry and others, local authority, government, etc., to act as partners in the delivery of those things. It's to me, it's a very simple, straightforward, strategic solution. But the agency needs to be very clear about where it sees areas for managed realignment, where we can do some serious habitat restoration.
Tom.
Yeah, you'll notice a theme in my answers, which is policies that have gone missing. And another one is marine net gain. If we're thinking about strategic restoration, that has to be a big part of it, because really, if that's done strategically, it could be an enormous amount of money for restoration. And importantly, going beyond, we've heard compensation is just keeping the status quo. That's exactly right. The marine net gain could potentially be taking us beyond that status quo to improving, which is what we need if we're going to hit good environmental status, hit 30 by 30. So that's another policy we need to implement, get it done.
Couldn't agree more. That's exactly what we're trying to do, to set up strategic targets which will help us achieve GES, which will help DEFRA develop their marine net gain policy. As I said earlier on, Dickon's doing some amazing stuff through Howell Marine Consulting on assessment framework for MNG. I couldn't agree more. Net gain should be net gain. It should be restoration and improvement.
Thank you. Slido.
So many speakers have mentioned putting nature at the centre of policy and planning. How does that practically look for marine industries? And I guess we've got 3 people on this panel there who can answer this. But also I think there's a question up in the balcony, I've been told.
Questions from the balcony?
It's Martin Kirby from Natural England. I just wanted to just sort of check in with the panel whether we're using the mitigation hierarchy as well as we could, getting towards 2030, because things will go quicker and smoother if we try and avoid the impacts and reduce them and mitigate them before we get to compensation.
Thank you. Those are linked but quite different questions. So let's start with the first one. How do we actually put nature at the centre of policy and planning in the marine environment?
I suppose I better take it.
Go on then.
I think the recognition that nature needs to be at the centre of decision making is in itself a massive move forward. I quoted Jamie, you said that nature has to be at the centre of decision making as a result of all the work we're doing to look at the future of the sea. So I think that in itself is a major step forward. How it's done, we may need to think a bit more about that. But going back to the point in the second question, and also the point that Tom raised, is we have had the mitigation hierarchy in place for many years. Industries are very used to working with the mitigation hierarchy, the regulatory process, and the question came from Natural England. Natural England are, I was going to say integrally involved, I don't want to, are closely involved with the regulatory, they help drive the regulatory process. Close consultation at the pre-application stage with the MMO and others, to look at how we're going to avoid before we mitigate and ultimately compensate. From an industry perspective, avoidance and mitigation is a lot cheaper than compensation. There is a strict route currently in place under the habitat regs through the derogation process for compensation. I know from my own personal experience, it's long, complicated, involves an awful lot of work, an awful lot of time, and in truth, an awful lot of money. So I would say that from an industry perspective, industry does everything it can to work with the mitigation hierarchy because it's better to do so and it's better to avoid. But it doesn't mean the compensation isn't there at the end of the day. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. Tom and then Chris.
Yes, I just think this isn't an innovative solution, but hopefully it's popular with the Natural England questioner. I think more funding for statutory nature conservation bodies will be helpful to everyone. It will be helpful to nature because we'll get better advice, and it will be helpful to developers because they can get that advice quicker and they can get better advice which allows planning to progress. We've been saying this for many years, and it seems to, the Treasury seems to be allergic to that idea. They talk about growth, they talk about what, Rachel Reeves is going out to all the regulators saying, how can you support growth? Well, ask not what your nation do for you, what can you do for them? She needs to give them more money if they're going to do their job properly. And yes, that maybe comes to need with innovative processes, and I think that work is going on. But without the money for that consultation to get that nature evidence into a different planning thing, we're just not going to progress.
Chris. Yeah.
So, from a fisheries point of view, I'll give it a little bit of context. Going back a few years, back in 2021, we as the Cornish fishing industry published our own fishing strategy. And number one, the most fundamental thing, this is in-depth engagement with the catching sector, people going to sea, people on shore, harbours, markets, processes, was actually getting a really good understanding about what's happening in our waters. Science is going to be the most fundamental thing to a positive, thriving fishing industry. So actually having good investment, I think, speaking back to Tom's points in terms of making sure there's actually good financial packages there, government support to actually work and use the fishing industry to build the most detailed data sets that we've got about what's happening in our waters, what's changing, and let's apply sensible management on that. I think at the moment still there's this inconsistent approach, this sort of missing overarching aim really about how we're actually managing our fisheries. We've got this whole new way of working through fisheries management plans, co-design, little bits of progress, but it feels a little bit slow still. It feels like we need to get on with it. And then we still have this international process that we go on every year where we decide how much we're going to catch of certain species next year, and that's a big decision made with the EU and ourselves. And they both kind of operate in two different ways of working, which I think then leads to quite inconsistent approaches about how we're managing things in the fishing industry. And I think we need to get those two merged together, or maybe one overarching aim about what does good fisheries management look like and what does a sort of thriving industry look like as well. So yeah, I think back to our original point, or my original point on our fishing strategy and putting that investment, getting a really good understanding and using the fishing industry to build a really detailed data set about what's happening in our waters.
Jamie.
I add just some practical stuff we've been doing at the Crown Estate. So I think there's just three things that help us put nature at the centre of decision making. It was my line on the slide earlier. So firstly, we're building the evidence. So when we look at each sector, we obviously try to avoid all the sensitive areas, and that's more like the let's not make it worse type calculation, if you like. But we also then have a totally separate process of building information just about the opportunities for nature. So we partner on that, we get information in from lots of bodies on it, and then we share that information back out. So that means that we can compare any given sector to opportunities for nature totally independently of each other and run scenarios and things. We then help sort our internal processes out. So we have something called a value creation framework that makes sure that when we make decisions, we look at all forms of value. And then the final thing we do is we publish. We now publish that this is our intent, this is what we plan to do, this is what we mean by our nature strategy, putting nature at the forefront of our thinking. Those documents are out. The most recent update was about a week or so ago. And that allows us, again, to collaborate, but hopefully help people also keep us to account. Look, Crown Estate, you said you're going to be thinking like this, you said you're going to be doing like this. And that just helps generate that momentum behind putting nature at the centre.
Thank you. With time in mind, I'm going to attempt to summarise. I think we have heard that, yes, 2030 targets are deliverable alongside a thriving blue economy. We have a lot of data and knowledge and experience, a lot of people who have been doing this, all of this, for a long time. What we need is a direction of travel from the government with a strategic overview and lots of funding for our regulators and offshore environment protectors. I'm sure everybody in the room will agree with all of that. It's enormously challenging, but it's great to hear such a range of perspectives. So many thanks to our fantastic panel.